So I think it's the reason why I used to not be able to, I always found it difficult to read briefs. It's a funny thing to say when you're a minister because that's, a big part of the job. But what I used to do is get other people to brief me, which is also a legitimate way to do it. But I would say I was an audio learner, and that's sort of true, but I think it was related to the illness. I think I could hear things and understand them, but I would get confused when I'd read things. It'd be all kind of a bit of a mess. Because I won't say I've got a dual diagnosis. You'll laugh at this, I've got a dual diagnosis of ADD as well, so I've got the whole package.
Today we've got a very special guest who is Della Bosca, and you're a former long-standing politician. You served in a large range of ministries. I've done a bit of a research on you, John, and it's quite amazing. You're the Minister for Health in New South Wales as well. You've done a whole bunch of things, and also more recently became a campaign director for the National Disability and Carers Alliance, now the NDR, the National Disability Services, and you also assisted in the establishment of the NDIS insurance scheme. And I'm very grateful for that. My mum was used that quite a lot, and it provided a lot of good support services for her until the end of her life. So thank you for doing that, because that was really, really important to us, and she got a lot of assistance from that during her time. So we appreciate that. And you've come on today to share your story on the lived experience. So welcome, John, and thank you very much for coming on board.
Thank you. No worries, Joel. Thanks.
So, John, do you want to start off with first about, you reached out via Bill Campus, said you'd be a great interview, and just with a little bit about yourself. So I'll let you share maybe your story a little bit first, then before we get into it.
I suppose in terms of lived experience of my mental health issues, it obviously goes back to my primary family. My father, my late father, he's passed away some time ago now. I have to start off by saying in his obituary, I described him as a hero because he did mightily try to contend with his mental illness and, succeeded up to a point. He had over a lifetime many very important professional roles, jobs that obviously mainly aimed at, good social purposes, and he was highly regarded in the industry he worked in, which was health and welfare. And pretty well all of my life, and I only became conscious of it a bit later, probably. I first became conscious of it when I was probably about 8 or 9, is that he had bouts of serious, the professional psychiatry calls it mania. It's mania, but it can accelerate into fully blown psychosis. And so the first time that happened that I knew about in terms of my dad was when I was about 8. And he was a man, at that time he would have been a man in his very early 30s. So, but I suspect that he'd had a previous incident as well as a teenager, but I don't really know that. I'm just from picking up sort of family gossip, I suppose, not gossip, but family bits and pieces of history. So that was very much a kind of a sort of introduction in the worst sense of it to mental illness, and it's potentially, and this is probably not a very politically correct thing to say, but it's potentially very destructive kind of capacity in terms of people's life and welfare. I was the oldest of at that time a family of 5. My mum was a young woman with 5 kids, and really bipolar. Especially severe bipolar, people can't be relied upon financially. My dad made a lot of bad, I think at that time, under the influence of the illness, a lot of bad financial decisions, which put my mum and our family in jeopardy in terms of our, ability just to even have shelter and put food on the table, literally. And he went into prolonged psychiatric care. And I think that the other point I'd make for the point of view of lived experiences, we're talking, this was 1963, 64. Without any disrespect to the profession, I think psychiatry was a lot more primitive back then. And I don't think he got well served by the treatment he got. So I think he got a lot of ECT. ECT has a place, some psychiatrists say these days still, but not as a cure for depression, and not as something that can help with manic depression. Also, the drugs were very crude in those days, and I think people didn't like staying on their medication because it was unpleasant and difficult, and often made them a bit ill. And that was very much the story of my dad. He'd just sort of he'd sort of come good again, get himself out of hospital, go on the medication for a while, get a good job oftentimes after a while, because he was a really impressive, knowledgeable person, and he'd get a good job, and then he'd go along for another few years, and then he'd have another crash. And so this was basically And I suppose, as I said, I don't want to talk about my brothers and sisters. My brothers actually weren't part of that family unit because they actually are sons of my father's second wife. But very much the kind of thing this does to you, I think, is not does to you, the kind of residual for people is leaves you with anxiety, because you would start to know the signs. You would really want your parent to stay well, and be able to do all the things a parent does. And that was when my dad was well. He was very charismatic, very entertaining and fun to be with, and all those sorts of positive things. And when he started to get ill, you'd know just little signs, little things would be there, little things he'd say. He had this habit when he was ill of turning all of the furniture and knickknacks and pictures in the house upside down. Don't really know why he did it, but he did it. And that would be an early sign. You'd see something upside down and you'd know that he would have at night time or something turned it over. I think that was one thing. It made you sort of anxious. There'd be a build-up to this. The second thing it did, it made you very secretive, because you'd be embarrassed about other people knowing about the problem thing. So you'd try to find ways to even conceal it from your other siblings, conceal it from your mother, and in my case. And that they're the two kinds of, in terms of early life. The sad story about genetics, which is, I suppose, maybe the next question you might have for me. The sad story about genetics is that if one parent is bipolar, there's always a chance that, 1 in 5 is going to be bipolar, and that was me. But I didn't know at the time. Indeed, one of my things in life, I sometimes regret. It should have been very obvious to me, but it wasn't. Again, I think that's that part of that, not facing up to reality, secretiveness, concealing what's really happening. I'd say I started to have occasional, really serious mood swings, and maybe even got to the point of being certainly manic in my late teens, and getting depressed as well in my late teens, early 20s. I was never treated and never diagnosed until I was just over 50. So for all that time, just dealing with it, as they say. But unfortunately, you can't really deal with it. So the big implication is, in my case, my kids like to think that things went okay, but, I know that there were certain times when I wasn't as focused a father as I should have been. I wasn't as good a father as I should have been or could have been. And certainly with my wife, I let her down so many times. Of course, you probably know, or you would know, that another thing that happens with bipolar 1 is, as well as financial irresponsibility, it's personal, sexual, and other kinds of, impulsiveness and irresponsibility. And that happens. And of course, when that happens in a relationship, it doesn't go away. It stays there forever. And, I had a fairly celebrated end to my career, I suppose. End to my public parliamentary career was really one of those examples. My doctor is always amazed that I could do my job and be as ill as I was sometimes, but somehow I managed it. And I think I managed that by being dependent on other people a little bit to cover up for my problems. So anyway, sorry, I think you just asked me one question.
It's fantastic. You see me nod in my head, because especially with your story, I completely relate to that. My mum was one of 11, and her dad had bipolar, and they were on a dairy farm, right? So you had 6 kids and 6 boys and 5 girls. And when he got unwell as well, you had my grandmother looking after 11 kids. So I can relate to exactly what you were saying, and especially stuff about financial responsibility. And you're right, it is a very destructive thing in the family unit. We didn't have a dad or anything around, so when mum got ill, we'd end up in a foster home or with friends and family for a long time. So I understand exactly what you said. I completely relate. That's why I was nodding my head like this. And it's quite amazing, as you said. Like my mum, when she got a job, she would hold down for a job for a bit, was a really good work, but then get stressed, go manic, and then have to go inside. So to be able to do what you've done, to be in one of the most stressful jobs as I could imagine, and to be so successful is quite amazing. So I know you obviously said a lot of good people around you, but just how did you manage it? Because it's not, you're very well credentialed, and you've done a lot in politics. I just can't imagine how you managed to do it for so long without having that unravel, let's say, until later in life.
Yeah, I think one of the things I think is that I'm not sure what the psychiatric theory would be about this, but there's a kind of real thing with bipolar, which is around adrenaline and dopamine, around anxiety and satisfaction, or, elation. And I think that's what used to happen a lot with me, particularly in the more exacting parliamentary portfolios. I'd almost sort of live on a dopamine hit, which I think was kind of like I was in a permanent, this is a terrible thing to say because it sounds like I was irresponsible, but I think I was in a permanent low-level mania for a lot of the time. And every now and then I'd get cranky or grumpy or depressed or whatever. But I think that sounds ridiculous, but I think that's part of the way I was able to do it. And the other thing is, when you're in that low-level mania, that's the other irony for people with a lived experience of bipolar, is that that's when you're the life of the party. You know, you're attractive and funny and people like you and you've got interesting stories and you don't fear anything, you don't care about anything. Life's all fun. It's only as the mania shifts up a gear or two that, it starts to become unpleasant and difficult. And I think that was somehow not all the time, because then I think this sort of irresponsibility let loose. And as I said, particularly it would hurt, the stuff I do would hurt my wife in particular. So, I had this sort of outlet, I suppose, too, which was a little bit of alcohol, a little bit of overspending. That I wasn't a gambler or anything, fortunately. That's one thing I wasn't. And as I said, occasionally this sexual irresponsibility. And, that was very much away from the person I am when I'm well, but it was sort of certainly when this low-level mania was happening was there. So I think it's the reason why I used to not be able to, I always found it difficult to read briefs. It's a funny thing to say when you're a minister, because that's, a big part of the job. But what I used to do is get other people to brief me, which is also a legitimate way to do it. But I would say I was an audio learner, and that's sort of true, but I think it was related to the illness. I think I could hear things and understand them, but I would get confused when I'd read things. It'd be all kind of a bit of a mess, because I'd say I've got a dual diagnosis. You'll laugh at this. I've got a dual diagnosis of ADD as well, so I've got the whole package.
Well, so look, it's amazing what you've accomplished whilst doing this as well, which would just make it that much harder. And it's quite an impressive achievement. And I was going to say as well, with you, from your knowledge and from your experience, obviously mental health awareness is a big thing now. But for me, it always seems to just focus on depression and anxiety. You don't hear stuff about schizophrenia or bipolar or young carers of the family unit much. So what can be done, let's say, moving forward to support families and people with bipolar more than what is done at the moment? Because from my experience anyway, like I'm 35, so I'm sort of young and old, but it was basically, mum would get hospitalised, cops and ambulance would come out, take her away, wouldn't see her for 3 months, bunch of lithium, drugs, ECT, back out again and expected to go back to normal, right? So what can be done moving forward, or what should be done to improve the situation for people with bipolar disorder?
Well, I think there needs to be a lot better understanding of it for a start. Like at the moment, I think other than people who have either a lived experience or know someone or as a friend or a family member, no one really knows what bipolar is. I mean, it's sort of almost like they think it probably was the inspiration for Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but they think it's some sort of, mythical kind of illness. But I think sort of demystifying bipolar would be a good start. The second thing is I think psychiatry, there needs to be a lot more focus on, at the moment there's sort of, the extremes are you go into a private hospital if you're insured, and they're pretty low level. If you're really sick, most private hospitals won't really be able to help you that much. Or you go into a public hospital where it's kind of really limited and only people in really extreme situation are kind of looked after. And the beds are so short and everything's got it in such a rush, and the doctors are so stressed, they just boot you out as soon as they can get rid of you. And so I suppose the sort of hospital in the home approach might be one of the kind of opportunities that, you sort of have kind of more, nursing, and maybe even they can be persuaded to do it. Doctors actually attending to people in their home environment, because I think part of the thing that makes bipolar worse is being thrown into this. It's not as bad as it used to be. Obviously, my dad used to go to Callan. Your mum probably did too. Going to Callan Park, and it is a frightening place. I mean, I wouldn't want to go there if I was feeling depressed and stressed and unhappy. So I think that's part of the problem, that, really treating people in situ where they live, if that were possible, or, that would be the best way to provide support. I think the other thing is, I'm the chairman of Family Drug Support, and Family Drug Support's got this philosophy that they don't try to look after the person who's using drugs. They try to kind of strengthen the capability of the family emotionally and otherwise to deal with the person taking drugs. The theory being that the person who's taking drugs will have a much better health outcome and possibly even deal with their addiction more effectively if they've still got family support. If the family breaks down and can't cope with the drug user and kicks them out or, sort of isolates them, then, that's obviously going to be a bad outcome. I think the same thing could be applied to bipolar mental health generally, that kind of giving some resilience training to the people that are near and dear to the person with bipolar might also be something. But having thrown those two ideas down, there's probably a lot more things you could do with some serious thought, and you've challenged me, so I think I might spend some time thinking about it.
Well, you mentioned one because you mentioned about your dad. You knew when your dad was getting unwell, but there's nothing you could do. Same with my mum. We knew when she was getting unwell. We'd call, the uncle, or we'd call someone and say, hey, she's getting unwell. She needs to go in. And they're like, oh, we can't do anything until she gets made involuntary or until, and there's a 3 or 4 week period where we had to wait, and there was all the risky behaviour was going on, right? So for me, I'm looking at from that's really negligent, right? We're telling you she's unwell. We know her better than most, and you can't do anything about it until she gets really, really unwell. So there's a 3 or 4 week period where we're at risk, where she might just decide to drive us to Perth or do something like that, and that's nothing we can do about it. You mentioned the same thing with your father knew when he was getting unwell, and there's nothing you can really do about it. So even currently, I don't know, unless someone wants to go voluntary, there's not much, I don't know where the process comes into place or how that can be moved forward, but I don't know if it's changed much from when me and you were growing up with this sort of thing.
No, I think it's possibly, and I'm not critical of the policy trend, but there's a big trend on, as you know, on prevention, headspace and all the kind of getting people early, and that's very good. The problem is that the real deficiencies are at the acute end. That's where you can't get treatment. That's where there's blockages. And so I think that there needs to be a big revision of the idea of, what happens at the acute end. The other problem is the workforce, like the psychiatrists themselves are attracted to the middle end. That's life is easier there.
Bit easier.
So it's tied with I take my hat off to my doctor. She works in the public system and does some private clients, but she deals at the, pretty well as I think all of our patients are at the acute end. It would be massively stressful to be a psychiatrist dealing 8 hours a day, one after another, with people with, really severe problems. So I take my hat off to the ones that do it well, but I think there are a few who are there for an easy ride, and, I suppose that's the way the system works.
Absolutely. And you mentioned ECT before. I'd love to touch on this because this is quite a common thing that comes up. What are your thoughts around ECT in general? My mum had a lot of it, so I'm quite... she died at 63, and I believe it was due to a large amount of ECT throughout her life, which developed conditions. So, I
think my dad eventually lost a lot of his mental acuity. He was still pretty with it when he died. He died quite a few years ago now, when he had the age of 83. And he put his mind and his body through a lot of treatment. You really kind of bash himself up a fair bit. So he was he was comparatively good nick. But yeah, he had a lot of ECT back in 1964. Then he had some again in the mid-70s. And I don't think it did him any good. In fact, I think it made him worse. I'm told, I'm not in a position to judge it scientifically, but I'm told that now psychiatrists don't use ECT except in very, very specific circumstances, and in those circumstances, certain kinds of catatonic depression or whatever, it has a beneficial effect. Well, I'll take their word for it, but I think for the people that they used to do it to, it was, I think, something bordering. No, they didn't really mean to do it, but it was torture.
Well, I found it very distressing because we used to have to go in, because my mum's a single mum, and so with the kids, we were her life, and we had to go in and see her all the time after it. So she'd be, she'd have it, and then she'd be in a room, and then we'd go in there, and she's, bit of drool out of her face and stuff, but they needed to shut her up, so they wanted us to come in there. So we'd be like young kids having to go on the psychiatric ward, a place called Greylands in Perth, which is a pretty big facility, and then we'd have to see her right after it. So we saw her all throughout her life, and she'd probably get every couple of years. And the outcome with the ECT in the end was she developed a condition called progressive supranuclear palsy, which was we got no PSP, it's called. It's a form of Parkinsonians or Parkinson or whatever. And then we had no history of that at all in our family. So, I was talking to the neuroscientist or neurosurgeon about it, whatever he was, and he was saying that was a contributing factor. So it's a bit of an interesting thing. It's obviously, if she didn't have that, would she have been able to get back, to looking after us at certain stages? But it's one of those things which is, if they don't have it sometimes, would they have not gone certain ways? And yeah, it's a very difficult discussion. Now, I get a lot of questions about it still, and there's a lot of groups online as well where it's still talked about quite commonly, especially in America still, actually, with people unsure about it, very scared of it, these sorts of things.
I think it might be still used a bit more in America. I think that it's pretty... My impression is that it's used very sparingly these days here, but as I said, I don't really know enough to be certain. I'm just going on what people have told me as sidebars. But
I was going to say, you mentioned something about resilience training before, which I found quite insightful. I almost view that the lived experience of the kids or the young people in that unit is the resilience training almost in a way. So what else would you like to see in place? And you mentioned resilience training for the family unit. What could kids or young people be provided, or what would you think would have helped you maybe in those situations if you took yourself back then?
Well, you get back to that sort of secrecy problem. You really felt there was no one you could trust to talk to. Maybe some people could trust a minister or a priest or something, but that, unless it was an exceptionally insightful minister or priest or someone who had some training in psychology, it usually wouldn't be very helpful. There was just your parents' work colleagues. You couldn't really, as you sort of came to understand what life was, the ups and downs of life, you'd know that it was dangerous to talk to his work colleagues about his problems because, it was like betraying him. It was like telling people that might actually want his job, for example. I mean, I didn't really think that in those terms. So I would say you want someone to talk to, but it was really hard to work out who you could talk to. And maybe there was some relatives that you could talk to, but the other thing is because families are all tied up, the politics of the family is there too. So you kind of have this, my dad's brothers, my uncles, they were all kind of really helpful, but other times they felt very strongly loyal to my dad. Other times they were a bit pissed off with my dad and really loyal to my mum, who was their sister-in-law. And not when I say loyal, I'm using sort of shorthand that doesn't really quite fit the bill, but you know what I mean? They were more connected one way or the other. And the same thing who can you talk to in your family even sometimes? It's a bit hard to know. So that's one thing, just sort of somebody who understands the lived experience, just anybody, ring them up. Even if all you know is their first name, might be helpful if you could talk to them for half an hour about how to deal with it. I know that's one thought. Maybe we should start that up.
For sure. I was going to say, how did you then stay in the straight and narrow yourself? Because if you look at a lot of research and stuff, people who grow up in these environments, they're more inclined to have worse outcomes in a lot of different areas, and you wanted to achieve amazing things. And which I think is like, if you go up in a situation like this, you can almost, use it, play the victim and, world's against me, this sort of thing. Whereas you've achieved an amazing amount despite this situation. So how did you manage to stay on the straight and narrow and do what you've done?
Well, I didn't really stay on the straight and narrow, but eventually, in a sense, the illness caught up, in a way, caught up with me. And that's, that my career ended when it ended in a kind of the old-fashioned kind of idea, a scandal. And, before that, there'd been another incident a few years before, which was not really my fault, but my lack of ability to make judgments, because I was, I think, a bit manic. Meant that I was making bad judgments about it. So I think that was it. And the other thing is that a lot of it ended up, as I was sort of saying before, a lot of it ended up being things that happened to my family or to my wife in particular. So the issue of as I said, that scandal of the dealing with that woman who was that kind of that irresponsible sexual behaviour. I didn't sort of control. I mean, I tried to control it when I was well. I controlled it when I was well, but I didn't control it when I was sick. And as I said, I think I kind of somehow I think I could switch for a while. I could keep it bottled up. That sounds ridiculous, I know, but then it would eventually burst out, and that's when I do the really irresponsible things. I think that's the way I put it anyway.
Yeah, and I was going to say, well, later in life, as you learned about this diagnosis, how have you been managing it since? Is it something just a medication you've been taking, or you've just been talking to someone more? How's it been since you got the diagnosis?
Well, when I first, when all that happened, when the end of my career and stuff, I started seeing a doctor who I still see. I only see her once a month now, or probably not even that, once every 6 weeks. Yeah, I take medication. I take lithium carbonate, the dreaded lithium carbonate, which works for me. I'm one of the lucky ones. I basically, being aware of it, really knowing, and I think I pick up the early signs myself, whereas before I wasn't even conscious of it. I think it's all those three things: having a good doctor, finding the right medication. There was a bit of mucking around to get to the right medication, but I think that's what I do. And I've kind of pursued a different kind of career. So like when I was running the Every Australian Counts campaign, it was reasonably stressful. It was a reasonably serious job. It was a very important job in a lot of ways. I could control the amount of pressure I was under most of the time, and you're not subject to the incessant criticism that you are in Parliament. So it was, I couldn't go, I don't think I could go back to being not that I would anyway, I don't think you'd go back to being a parliamentarian because, I just realised that incredible kind of pressure, question time, people attacking you, the media going to a press conference. I think sometimes, there's I don't know if you've ever watched a movie called The Ruling Class. Have you ever seen
I've never seen it, no.
Oh, with your interest, you probably should see it.
Okay.
It's about Peter O'Toole, and he's sorry, it's not about Peter O'Toole. Peter O'Toole is the star of it. He acts the role of a British aristocrat who, hard to say, but he's probably got acute bipolar, and the whole story is really set around what happens. Him and a lot of the portrayal is how bad he becomes when he's subject to other people criticising him and attacking him, and that sort of changes him from being a kind of peaceful kind of bipolar person to being an aggressive one. And it's a good movie, so you'd probably like it.
And I was going to say as well, with your there's this term now, which is great to hear, young carers. So young carers seem to be getting a bit more, in Victoria anyway, a bit more included in the conversation. So young people or people of a parent with a complex mental health issue, they generally were always forgotten about. From my perspective, anyway, from our perspective, it would have been the case. Whereas now there seems to be a little bit more awareness and a bit more organisations that are actually helping those kids. So with your role as the National Disability Carers involved in the Carers Alliance, how do you see young carers being supported, and what are some things that should be hopefully maybe coming in place for young carers maybe you can see in the future?
Well, the answer to that is largely depends on what happens with the NDIS and what changes are made to the NDIS, because there's a kind of real opportunity to have for people to be carers and be family carers and be supported in that financially and other ways, as well as training and all sorts of opportunities. But there's kind of one set of concerns that may not always remain part of the system, because it's also subject to, the pub talk is that's kind of where the rorting in the system comes from. So-called rorting in the system comes from the people kind of paying family members, but I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with people paying family members, but people say some people take it to an extreme and they're not really caring. Anyway, that's really, I think, one thing. Depends what happens with the NDIS. I think I get back to this idea of, people having the opportunity to be trained. To trained is not necessarily the right word, but, to get knowledge, capability, and have that as a kind of free gift from somewhere, from state governments, from health departments, from mental health departments, from NGOs that specialise in mental health, whatever it is. That's what I think we need to be looking to.
Because to me, for me, what it comes down to is like, you've got young people, you can't choose your parents, right? You can't choose your parent. You can't choose it. That's your parent, and that's the way it is. They've got a complex mental health challenge. You know them best. You're under their care. If something happens, you're there first. And your life is really, as you said before, can be quite destructive. Your life is quite frankly changed by the complex mental health condition at certain different times. And that can really alter the course of your family's, of the young person's future, right? So my question is more around what interventions would actually be realistically. So in Victoria, we have a place called Satellite Foundation, which is one place which brings together kids and who have a parent with a mental health issue, brings them to countries and that, brings them together to do workshops with art and all this sort of stuff. But the main thing for them is they're getting people together who think they might be alone in their situation, but every kid there's got a parent with maybe bipolar or schizophrenia, right? So what could be done? Because I think it's a long-term approach to getting involved at this intervention stage at a 9 or 10-year-old with a kid and giving them some, self-esteem or letting them know that they're not alone could change the outcome of that person's life when, if they don't have any intervention, they're more inclined to maybe not go in the right direction. So I'm sort of, what under that could be done, or is it even a consideration for people in these sort of...
No, it's certainly a consideration. I think that's what I was sort of trying to get at. You've actually put it much more concisely and accurately than I had. But I mean, I think you need to find a forum for people to have someone to talk to learn resilience, to learn, like I said, it's a learned thing. I mean, to learn capability. I mean, unfortunately, we both know the gaps in the system, which have always been there. They're not new. In fact, they're probably a bit better now than they used to be back 40 years ago. But the gaps in the system mean that, if you got that situation where your mother or your father is getting sick, what are you going to do about it?
You can't do anything about it, yeah.
But you should be able to do something about it. You should be able to. There should be someone you can talk to, someone that can be aligned into the system, the health system, the mental health system to help you cope.
I was going to say as well, what about from the psychiatrist's perspective? Because I don't know what your experience was like with them, but we were never explained anything and we were sort of just a nuisance to the psychiatrist, I presume. So how do you think psychiatry or psychiatrists in treatment of the actual person needs to change to actually include the family members?
Yeah, I think that's a big problem. Psychiatry really is individually focused, as I'm sure you know better than me, and it's all about the individual. And in fact, as you say, oftentimes in a psychiatric sense, the other people in the relationship are a nuisance. They're a problem. They're to be solved. They're not part of the structure. I mean, now I don't think all psychiatrists think like that, but I think that is the classic psychiatric view. So I think you probably need sort of people I think you need this sort of idea. As I said, the chairman of Family Drug Support, and I think you need some sort of family-friendly kind of treatment of it. I mean, and the other thing is people need to be frank about it. I mean, as I said, the problem of people keeping family secrets all the time is always the sort of bane of any kind of treatment program, because people don't talk, don't tell anyone what's going on. I suppose probably just taking a stab at it, I reckon that mostly psychologists would be better placed to do that kind of work than psychiatrists, because a lot of general psychiatrists just sort of, size the patient up, talk to them for 10 minutes, give them some drugs, tell them to come back in a month, and they come back in a month. If they're better, they think give them some more drugs. If they're not better, they try some other drugs.
Which for me is a frustrating way they look at it, because, their treatment impacts a family unit. So if that person's got kids or whatever, that directly impacts the family unit. So it's not just doing whatever if they get it wrong. It's a very big problem, not for them, but it's for the kids the parent will go home to, or the family they're supposed to support. So it's really, I don't know if I'm presuming they take it seriously enough, but for me, anyway, from my experience, it was never much of a consideration. But I love what you said about people keeping secrets, and I think people do that maybe just to protect kids, but at the end of the day, you're the one living with the parent. You damn well know what's going on. So if someone just treats you like an adult, even though you might be 9 or 10 or younger, at least that way you have a bit more of a fuller picture. It wasn't until I was a bit older until I got told a lot of things which I should have known about when I was younger. It would have helped me out a lot. I don't know if you felt that same way.
Exactly the same to me.
Yeah. And I was going to say then, with the NDIS and with, let's say, mental health and let's say bipolar moving forward, is it more of a thing of, more in-home support? Because I know recently when it came in place, my mum had lived by herself and it was hard for her to manage, but her just having people come and get her up and about and help with some laundry and stuff like that was really, really helpful with the services like, nutritionist. She had a nutritionist. She had, someone come in and help her with fitness and stuff, it was really, really important to her. And I was really, really grateful to her.
Yeah, no, it's good. I mean, I think some people who have bipolar, even serious bipolar, aren't going to they need mental health support, not the NDIS. The NDIS is about disability. You get to the point where the illness has disabled you. I mean, that sounds like that's what happened. That did happen to my dad, but he had a different situation because his second wife worked and she had a job and they lived in Orange, and it was much more, he was in a sense disabled. He couldn't really work, but, he had someone to look after his second wife, and, my brothers lived there for a fair while until they sort of got older and moved out. But so, yeah, I think that rather than look to the NDIS, which is good for certain kinds of people who've been bipolar, become effectively disabled, need that sort of support like you described. There's other people like me, well, hopefully I won't need access to anything, but I mean, in theory, what we need is better mental health access, and maybe, as I said, hospital in the home. Maybe some instead of going off to a kind of glorified motel as a private hospital, or we're still a public hospital where you're only going to get treated if you're they think you're going to do something extra.
Yeah.
There's got to be a point in between, because so many people deal with the illness in a sort of grey area. They're not a threat to themselves or anyone else, but they can't have a normal life because their thoughts aren't working. They take risky behaviours sexually, financially, everything else. They need some kind of intermediate support between the extreme of a hospital and nothing, which is kind of the other alternative.
That's a great point. I was going to say, when you told people about your diagnosis, what was the reaction? Some people go, "Oh yeah, I had a parent with that as well," or what was the reaction from people?
I haven't really sort of told that many people, really. I mean, obviously my wife knows. I've told one of my really good friends, and he just said, "Oh, well, he." Like alluding to what you said before, he said you kept that well hidden for a long time. My sisters all said, "Oh, but you're not like Dad," and I said, "No, I'm exactly like Dad, and that's the problem here. I've just been lucky. I've gotten better treatment and got it more." Yeah, my mum was a really good person, but she wasn't capable of dealing with Dad. Like she wasn't capable of dealing with him as well or sick in a kind of a way. Yeah, she was very much a 1950s woman, and my wife's been very supportive and put up with a lot of when a lot of people wouldn't have. So I'm very grateful for that. My sons know, obviously. So not many of them are friends. Oh, sorry, that's not true. Yeah, another friend of mine, I said, yeah, he didn't actually really focus or know what bipolar was. And I said, it's used to be called manic depression in the old days. He said, oh, yeah, I've got that. I take, so it's like Zyprexa or whatever it is. But he means for depression. He was focused on the depression side of things. So what amazes me is, there's another mate who the third one of my close friends that I said, we're just having a beer, and I said, I've got this condition called bipolar, and he said, oh, so have I.
Oh wow, there you go.
He'd lived with it. He'd lived with it for 25 years himself. We were best friends from childhood, and so, yeah. And that was one thing I always say to I don't know if you found out doing all this work that you do, I sort of say to my psychiatrist, I wonder sometimes if birds of a feather, it seems to me that there's a lot of people in my environment who are bipolar friends and family.
Yeah, what I found is when I did the first video I did, a shared this story online, I had a heap of people private message me saying this and that, and it was quite amazing how many people were in a similar situation, and they all said the same thing, we thought, well, just us. So it was that's the whole reason why we do the content, because there's a lot of content now, John, about depression and anxiety online, but there's not much about bipolar, schizophrenia, or growing up in those situations. So it's quite interesting to see that there's a lot of people who come out of woodwork, about people from America, Finland, Germany, all that sort of stuff, and they see clips like this and hear your story. I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of messages as well about it. But I was going to say as well, because we talk to a lot of people listen who are younger people as well, who are teenagers maybe going through this situation, and they're a bit frustrated in their situation. So what would you maybe say to a younger person who maybe, let's say, 10 to sort of 18, and they've got a mum or a dad who has this complex mental health condition? What would you say for them as some things they need to focus on or maybe do so that they can go on and have a pretty fulfilling life?
Well, for themselves, in terms of like where they are in their family, I'd say try to find someone that you can talk to absolutely honestly about what's going on, whether it be an uncle or an aunt or a family friend or a priest or a family doctor or someone that you can talk to. So that's the first thing. And the second thing I'd say to them is when your mum or dad are sick, it's not them. It's them, but it's not, that's not what they want to present to you. That's not the life they want for you. So, you can switch off about the fact that, they're behaving really oddly and that sort of, strangely and doing risky things. And the third thing is you probably have to stand up for yourself because, the fact of the matter is, even though you're their parent, when they're not well, they're going to say crazy things and maybe try to do crazy things, and they want to drive you to Perth or whatever it is. You've got to say, no, Mum, have you seen a doctor, In terms of their own lives, it's a hard one, isn't it? Like, I think you need to be prepared for the fact that either environment or genetics is going to predispose you to have your own problems, either post-trauma type problems and or the illness itself, if you lose the genetic lottery, as early in your life as possible. If you identify signs of not feeling well or doing things that are kind of not appropriate, then you should see a doctor and get a letter to go to see a professional and talk to them about it. Because if you have a diagnosis, I know I'm old-fashioned, the earlier you have a diagnosis and get a treatment from a good doctor, the better life you'll have.
That's great advice. And just one more question before I let you go, John, and thank you very much for your time today. The highlight from your career, because you've done a lot of different things, and it's quite amazing. And I read it's a great story to share because it just shows, people who can grow up in this environment like you did can go on and do a lot of great things. So what was maybe a highlight or two from your career?
Well, I think the highlight of my career, in a kind of way, there's two highlights. And they're both about campaigns rather than about policies, but I do like policy stuff. And one highlight is the 91 state election, New South Wales election campaign, which was where the Labor Party, which I was the secretary of, was supposed to be totally and comprehensively beaten again, and we virtually got ourselves into a winning position in the subsequent election. It went very well. Like next time we won, but that wasn't nearly as exciting as doing so well as we did in 91. And the other one was the NDIS. It was a real sense of satisfaction as we worked through the kind of campaign and all of the kind of lobbying and everything, and then it all just fitted together so naturally to end up getting the NDIS. But I think the thing I'd really want to emphasise is that the best reason for that decision to get early treatment, to ask for help early, is because of what you do to the people you love. That's the problem with bipolar. Apart from your kids, in my case, and I think many people who suffer from bipolar's case, in my case, what I did to my wife, I put her through hell more than once, many times, and I can't ever thank her enough for what she put up with. But it also changes things irrevocably. So the earlier you get treatment and help, the better you'll be.
Now, John, thank you very much for your time today. We appreciate you sharing your story on the Lived Experience podcast. I'm sure this will be very, very helpful for a lot of people around the world. As I said, we have listeners from all over the world. As I said, Dave, at the start, it's just amazing to have you on the show, person of your stature, to share your story and obviously give a lot of hope to others who might be a bit younger and to sort of see all the things you've been able to achieve growing up in this situation. So well done to yourself, and thank you very much for your honesty and openness today on the Lived Experience podcast. We appreciate it.
Oh, thanks very much. Thanks, Joel.